it's me, Maya, again, and I'm here to talk to you today about some considerations that are important for when you're on a library renovation task force. I want to start with one of the most important things I think in building any building nowadays, especially since the 2000s, is that you can never have enough outlets. Outlets. They're so important because if your patrons or your staff don't have anywhere to plug in their computers, their phones, their tablets, their e-readers, then you're just going to have to end up getting those little docking stations, and those are just cumbersome and really just look like an afterthought. Another important thing to consider in the 21st century in any building is to make sure you've got good Wi-Fi hotspots and Ethernet cables built into the infrastructure of the building. I really think that if you plan where you want those in the first place, you don't have to work your way backwards, because otherwise you get Ethernet cables coming out of walls and floors in random places, and Wi-Fi hotspots just like screwed to the ceiling in places that don't really make sense. So it's important to think about that as you're renovating or building a library. Another thing that I think is really essential is to think about heating and ventilation. I have worked in places with bad heating and ventilation, and nothing makes it harder to work than sweating or shivering. Also, ventilation might come up with certain technologies like 3D printers, but a little bit more on that in a moment. It's also important to think about building spaces specifically for printers, computer labs, or touchscreen lookup stations. It's important to have these technologies in mind when you build the spaces, because it will create a better flow to your library. It'll be easier for patrons to find them if they're placed in intentional places, and it will already have all the setup for, like we talked about before, the Wi-Fi, the Ethernet cables, and outlets. It's also important to consider whether or not you're trying to have a makerspace in your library. Makerspaces require proper ventilation, as I mentioned before, and need a specific amount of space to safely use makerspace technologies. It's also important to think about study rooms or collaborative spaces and what types of technologies you expect your patrons or staff to use in those spaces. So it's important to have room and outlets enough for screens or projectors, and plenty of extra outlets for student or patron laptops and phones and all those things we mentioned before. So anyway, that's in short what I would recommend if I was on a library renovation task force, and I hope to see you all next week. Happy Halloween!